Hi, everybody. It's Rhonda Cobb, the Money Coach, and you're going to love today's show. We are kicking off the annual Miami Book Fair, and today we have with us authors of a national bestseller. It's called Our Towns, and it's written by James Fallows and Deborah Fallows, and they're joining us today. Do you know that it took them 5 years to do the research for this book? And they traveled across America in a single engine prop plane. How much fun could that be? So we want to find out, why did they do that? And how much fun they had and see what they have to tell us. But I can tell you, I read the book. It's a good read. So let's get started. Welcome, James and Deborah. How are you today?
We're
Thanks.
delighted to be talking with you.
So happy to be here.
Awesome. So, after reading the book, I was a little curious. What made you decide to take off and travel all those miles in your little airplane and go all over the place?
So Deb, why don't you lead off?
Yes, well, our life has been one of adventure all along. We've lived in a lot of different countries, most recently in China for about 5 years, ending up in around 2011. And after that, when we came back to Washington, D.C., which is allegedly our home, we were ready to take off again after a while just to go out and see the country in the same kind of fashion that we had seen China, in the small towns, in the rural areas, away from the big cities, to kind of get the pulse of the country to see what was happening. And we had this great vehicle of a little plane, which we'd been flying for about 10 or 15 years at that point, and decided that it was a good idea.
And it was a good idea. It turned into a national bestseller, Started out well, and it turned out well. How much fun did you guys have doing that while you were traveling around?
It was really fun because something that I know probably only a small number of the listening audience are small plane pilots themselves or in their families, and so it may be hard to envision how just basically spontaneous a way of travel this is. You don't have to book things, 90 days in advance to avoid extra fees. You don't have to get to the airport 2 hours in advance, et cetera. We could just decide one afternoon, okay, there are some things happening in Ohio. Let's go check them out. And if the weather was okay, because the weather is the overwhelming factor in small plane flight, we could say, okay, let's just go to northern Ohio. Let's go to Erie, Pennsylvania. Let's go to North Carolina. And so there was it was not all glamour, to put it mildly. The places where we'd land the plane, usually there was no food and no rental car, and so you were sort of scrapping for ways to get into the town. But it was there was a kind of pioneer aspect to it, which reminded us of our time in China, traveling around to remote villages, and also about sort of road trips in America over the centuries as ways of seeing the country.
And also, just to be sure that we set the record straight for your audience, this was not flying around in net jets or exec jets. This is a pretty little plane, but it's more like flying around in a Volkswagen Beetle than it is in a net jet. Jim is the pilot, and he's a terrific pilot. I do ground control, which is kind of everything else besides being the pilot. So it is a more rough and ready experience than your first thought might be.
Oh, I understand. It's basically a two-seater, right?
Well, we have a luxurious 4 seats in the plane.
Okay.
We have 4 seats, 2 wings, 1 engine, and crucially, 1 parachute. This is the kind of plane called the Cirrus airplane, Cirrus SR-22, made in Duluth, Minnesota, that is now the most popular small plane in the world because there's a parachute for the entire plane. And if something should go wrong, the whole plane can come down to a gentle landing.
Oh, that's cool. I hope you never have to use it, but it sounds really cool.
Also, as a point of reference, there's obviously no bathroom and no flight attendant. So
Yeah, there is that. As a hilarious side note, though, it's been 30 years, I guess. I took a job in a different state, and before I left Toledo, I had a friend who had a similar kind of plane, and he said, "I love to fly. I'll fly you to your new job." And I said, "Okay." So I brought my essentials of what I needed for the first week on the job, and we flew to the new job, and we landed at a tiny airport. And my new boss came to pick us up, and he said, "When you said you were flying in, I did not expect a model airplane on a rubber band."
Well, it's close to the, private aviation sounds like some ritzy thing, but there's a kind of, it is, as Deb says, like driving across the country in a VW Beetle or VW van or something. You do have a sense of being close to, close to reality.
Yes, it was. It was definitely a no frills experience. So I can vouch for you all there. But the fact that you guys did this for more than a couple of years and over 100,000 miles is pretty impressive. So tell us, what is the state of our towns? How are we doing?
Jim.
So I will give the kind of boring, short policy message, and Deb will give the vibrant human message. So the policy message is that at the national level, I think people of every political persuasion know this is a difficult time for the country. Whatever political team you're on, there are challenges in national level politics. But what was so amazing to see in Mississippi, in South Dakota, in South Carolina, in California, in Maine, in all these other places we went, is that most people, most places feel like their communities are getting better, that they have problems, but they're dealing with them and they're improving the downtown and they're finding ways to create new schools and they're having new arts projects and they're having things like your book festival. And, I'm assuming that people who've been in Miami for a long time would say, oh yeah, here are the 15 ways that Miami is a more vibrant community than it was a generation ago. And people say that in Fresno, California. They say it in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And they say it in Duluth, Minnesota. And they say it most places around the country.
And what we found in the towns, no matter if they were 1,500 people or 25,000 people or 200,000 people, there was a refrain that was very common, which was, this town is just the right size. It's big enough that there's lots going on here, and it's small enough that I can make a difference, that we can make things happen. And people really had a sense of agency that if they needed to fix something in their town or improve something in their town, the buck stopped with them, and it was up to the citizens of the town to get together to work beyond whatever political or socioeconomic or ethnic differences they had for the betterment of their communities. And we really saw so much participation bubbling up from all different kinds of sectors, from all different kinds of people, and working together to make something happen and be accountable for it. And I think part of that is knowing that when you live in a town, you're going to keep running into the same people. You'll see them when you take out your trash or when you go to the grocery store or at the PTA meetings. And so there is a strong drive to be civil about what you're doing and to get along and to have some greater purpose in mind that is, less anonymous when you're talking about that compared with the national scene.
Well, I think that's just a very important and key point that you just made, that the people in the towns that are rebuilding and thriving or starting to thrive are people that have decided that if it's to be, it's up to me. I have to go out and participate. I have to be a member of the community, and I have to care about the other members of the community, whether I agree with them 100% of the time or not. And I just think that's such a good takeaway from your book and from your whole trip. That alone might have made it the whole thing worth it, in my opinion. But it's so cool because there were such good stories in this book about what people were doing and how they were doing it and how they were working together. When you guys started out on the journey, did you expect to find what you found?
So I will start on this. We, as Deb said, we've been living in China for a long time, and we mainly wanted to say, what would you learn just by showing up in places like Sioux Falls, South Dakota, or Holland, Michigan, which were two of the first places we went to, or Rapid City, South Dakota. So it was really just, what would it be like? Because Deb had been to Sioux Falls once. I'd never been there, although I'm from the West Coast, but I hadn't been to South Dakota in a long time. And so initially it was just, what would be the impression and the surprise of being there? And then sort of month after month and year after year, we planned to do this only for a short time, but it ended up being so interesting we kept going. We ended up having this cumulative sense of, you won't believe what we just saw in South Dakota. You won't believe what we just saw in rural Maine. You won't believe what we just saw in South Carolina. And so just trying to convey the excitement and the vividness that most people have about their own communities. I think that was the big surprise, and we had no idea that that was going to be there when we began.
Oh, that's so
Deb,
cool.
do you agree?
Oh, yeah, I agree. And we deliberately went to the kinds of towns that most people don't know about unless they live in the vicinity. You know, we all have an impression of what's it like in Brooklyn or what's it like in San Francisco, but we don't necessarily have an opinion of what's it like in Columbus, Mississippi, unless you happen to live in maybe Oxford, Mississippi, or in Ajo, Arizona, unless you might be from Phoenix. So everything was really fresh to us. And as Jim said, it was interesting that there was this huge gee whiz factor at the beginning. Gee whiz, can you believe that they're capturing all the satellite data in this center right outside Sioux Falls, South Dakota? Who knew? There were these kind of gee whiz factors all around until we started to reach the point about 5 or 6 cities in where we thought, gee, it may be gee whiz one by one, but there's some commonalities here that people are really creating and experimenting with, for example, new kinds of high schools. When we saw skilled technological training in a number of different sectors in a Camden County, South Georgia high school where kids were learning high skills for automotive or robotics or construction or nursing. We recognized all along the way it wasn't just one thing happening in one place, but there were some patterns. Like different towns were experimenting with the same kinds of schools through Mississippi or California or Oregon or Burlington, Vermont. And so some of these gee whiz factors eventually started making patterns for us. And I think that's why we kept going, because it was just so compelling. And also we wanted to get away from just the northeast sector of the country. We thought, now we need to see what it's like in the deep south or in the southwest or through the Great Plains state and on and on.
I think it's really cool. It was a really good undertaking of it's sort of like taking the temperature in different spots across the country, and the things that you uncovered that people can read about in the book, the different schools and the different ways that downtowns are being revitalized, and they're vibrant with people opening businesses and sharing their talents, and importantly to all people in all towns everywhere, supporting those businesses and supporting those talents, because from a money standpoint for everywhere and everyone, I think that's what's going to make the country be able to continue to thrive. And so I think it was a really, really cool trip or set of trips that you took. And the book just lays it out so nicely. And, for the amount of time and effort you put into it. Did you guys